Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. And we do have a truly global audience for today's session. So I thank you all for making the time to listen in as we discuss the mega trends for the future of work and human capital. Firstly, just to get us started, a little bit of housekeeping. All of the attendees are all muted. But we would urge you to share your questions with us. Both myself and my colleague Corey are online here. We're going to be monitoring the questions as you send them in, and we'd welcome those for you to send them to us. And Corey and I will put those to David and Karl as we go through today's session. We plan to make time towards the end of the session as well to wrap up any questions that we don't get to as we go through the session. We're also going to be recording today's session, so don't worry. If you've got colleagues that weren't able to make it or you want to share this with others in your organisation, we'll be sharing the recording post the event and sending that out to everybody that's registered, so you'll all get a chance to review it if you weren't able to get everything today or get everybody that you wanted on the session today. So to get us started, we're really very pleased today to have two key thought leaders in this space join us and to discuss these trends. David Wilson, CEO of the Fosway Group, and Karl Mehta, CEO of EdCast. Welcome and thank you both for making time to join us today. I know you're both busy people, so I'm sure the audience thanks you as much as I do. We're really looking forward to your insights today as we get in. I'm sure most of the audience are probably familiar with you both, but just as a little bit of an introduction, David is the founder and CEO of the Fosway Group, Europe's #1 HR industry analyst, a major commentator on HR, talent and learning industries for over 20 years. David's a strategic advisor to many major corporate and supplier organisations, both in the UK and across Europe. So David, welcome and thank you. David's also someone I've had the privilege to know over many years in this space. And Karl Mehta. Karl is EdCast CEO and, of course, my boss. So I'm on best behaviour today as we go through today's session. So Karl, hopefully I get this right. Indeed, as well as being a truly inspiring boss, Karl is also a serial entrepreneur, author, investor, engineer, and civil servant with over 20 years of experience in founding, building, and funding technology companies, both in the US and internationally. So David and Karl, thank you and both welcome aboard.
Thank you. Thanks, Shay.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to have you here. So look, let's jump straight in and let's get started. And maybe Karl, if I can put the first question to you, what are the major trends driving the future of work currently that you're seeing in the conversations you're having with kind of CEOs around the world?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, David, from the Fosway Group, and thanks everyone for joining this morning. It is said that may you live in interesting times. So here we are in those interesting times. When we look, the work, how it got transformed, and if we put ourselves like 20 years from now, and we will look back and say, how did this whole thing got changed and transformed? We will really see fundamentally some of the economic shifts that are happening today that will have a huge long-term implications 20 years from now. Fundamentally, any kind of work, what the work is, where that work gets performed, how that work gets performed, it's all driven by economics, where you can create the highest value creations. And human capital investments or the work investments that goes that directly correlates to that economic cycle. So here in the US, we say it's the economic stupid. So really, let's look at kind of the mega trends, or I would call it the mega shifts that's happening from an economic standpoint, which is ultimately pushing work in a completely new way. So number one is this whole concept of creator economy, or my friends at Andreessen Horowitz here calls it passion economy. And I'll explain a little bit quickly on each one of them, but I'll just name out the four key economic mega trends. Second is the platform economy, every company becoming a platform. Third is the digital economy that we're all very familiar with. And the fourth is the skills economy. So let's look at each one of these just very quickly and connect the dots and see how they are literally impacting everything that we think about the work and human capital and skills and capabilities. So creator economy is about people using their passion. We are all fundamentally, as human beings, we are creative beings at the very core. We may have been stuck in some work that does not utilize or leverage fully our creative abilities. But now we're living in times where there are tools and technologies and distribution platforms available, and 50 to 100 million people around the world has moved into this creator economy. They are creating, whether it is content or whether any kind of work that they themselves are creating out of their own creative skills. You see the examples of that with YouTube stars and TikTok stars. So these folks have created their own employment. And the key theme here is unbundling, and you'll see that across all those 4 economic shifts. So there is an unbundling happening from work to employment. Those two things for the past several hundred years, or even thousands of years, was kind of, maybe hundreds of years, not thousands, was connected. And now we are seeing that unbundling. You can do the work without employment. And this whole class of creator passion economy, and this is growing at mind-boggling speed. So you will see not just 50 to 100 million, you will see 300, 400, 500 million people. This is also one of the reasons that gave rise to the Great Resignation, because these are the folks who are feeling that, hey, I don't need an employment to do the work. And that's sucking out talent out of the employment, the formal employment market. And we are all feeling the heat of it. But this is one of these underlying economic shift that's driving that. And I read a survey, 70% of the US employees or US workforce have some kind of a side gig. So it kind of correlates with the data, because a creator passion economy manifests in some kind of a side gig. There's also a Gallup survey that always shows for the last several years that here, at least in the US, 70% of the workforce is actively disengaged or not engaged at work. So again, there is some correlation between both those 70%, but fundamental shift is that people can find work and their creative passion without employment. And that's having an impact on the corporate sector. The second big trend, or not trend, but really the economic shift, is the platform economy. So there's enough books written on it. And every company, if you look at the top 5 companies on the stock market with market capitalization, the common theme across all those companies is they're all platform companies. And there's again the similar theme of unbundling, which is and here there's an unbundling of your company's product or services from your own development or your own formal employees. Because as you become platform, you're leveraging the entire world to help you grow and to help you build your platform. So think about when you were spending time either on Google, or you're spending time on Facebook, or any of those companies, or even Apple, you are helping them build that. If you're a developer, you are creating your own applications on the top of that API. Again, this platform economy is pushing people to become their own developers and disconnecting or unbundling work from employment, taking away skilled talent out of the market, creating the talent shortage that we all see. The third big mega trend is the digital economy, that there's not much to be said. We all have been experiencing it for the past 20 years since the .com. And there's no company or no organization on the planet who is not affected by digital. And if they don't have an active digital transformation ongoing, they will probably not survive. But the big implication of it, especially with COVID-19, that accelerated this digital transformation by literally 5x what we would have done as a global organizations in the next 20 years. We've seen that already happening in the past few years. And that is bringing an unprecedented new set of capabilities that organizations have to stand up to in order to survive and thrive. So that's another big mega force, and that's not much to be said, but we all know about it. But then that comes down to the fourth one, which is the skills economy. We have always been, my friend Josh Burson said, we've always been in the skills economy. Obviously, people get hired for skills. But what we have not seen in the past, and what we are seeing now, is the type of skills that are required in order to survive or thrive in the workplace is very different than what we've ever seen. It's not just about hard skills or soft skills. With this hybrid workplace or remote first, the human skills are becoming actually not soft skills, but they're becoming hard skills, whether it is empathy, whether it is compassion, and then of course digital skills. And there is a lot of data and survey out there. We've ourselves done that 70% of the US workforce is not ready for digital skills. And that is putting a lot of strain in the organizations and in their growth plans. So just to quickly summarize, and both of this, by the way, the skills economy and the digital economy is also having that similar underlying theme, which is the unbundling, because there is an unbundling happening between roles and skills. You're not hiring for roles anymore, you're hiring for skills. Mm-hmm. And digital economy, again, is creating an unbundling of work and workplace, because a couple of years back, work used to get performed at a workplace. Now we don't know what a workplace is. I may be in my hotel room, I may be at a beach resort. So again, there is a unbundling happening between the workplace. So those are just quick thoughts, and I'd love to hear, David, your thoughts on this, whether you agree, disagree.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karl. I mean, that's a great way to kick us off. David, likewise, I'd love to hear your thoughts across that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly a good summary of some of these kind of true mega trends, right? Sometimes we talk about the mega trends, and they sometimes feel quite tactical, but I think ultimately there are some tectonic shifts, if I can put it like that are going along within the underlying world of work and the economies. I mean, obviously, Karl also referenced some of the sub-factors that influence those, right? So the pandemic being a pretty massive one in terms of accelerating the speed with which companies have had to realign and maybe rediscover certain things, like how do they really connect with employees and understand how engaged they are or not, suddenly changed completely when they weren't in an office. I also think, coming back to some of the points that Karl talked about around the skills. I mean, I think sometimes we talk a lot about skills, and certainly from my point of view, I've been around this loop many times over the last 25 years and talking around skills. We see points at which this seems to become a pivotal topic, and then sometimes it fades away around again. And I think at the end of the day, it's always an underlying issue. We sometimes conflate two different things, though: skills with a capital S, meaning skilled people, and then skills with a small s, meaning the sort of, the sub skills, the micro skills, and all the things that we need to be able to do, right? What makes up that skilled person is a whole set of skills and a whole set of capabilities and a whole set of experience. And I think the challenge that the pandemic has created for companies is it broke down the assumptions around, employment, where I worked, whether I choose to work or not, where I live. That's obviously a big thing that we've yet to really understand the full implications. Lots of people took an opportunity to relocate because of pandemic, and yet we've yet to understand what that looks like on the other side of that. They can do the job from anywhere, but that means they can also choose to be employed by anyone. And hence that also fans the flames around things like Great Resignation. We talk a lot about hybrid work, through this whole, remember those conversations probably in about 6 months from the pandemic, really in the US and Europe, talking about the new normal. All right. And here we are probably another year and a half on, and we're still struggling to understand what the new normal really is. And in particular, the assumptions companies were making around everybody's going to go back in the workplace, nobody's going to go back in the workplace, everybody's going to be remote. Companies really don't understand how that stuff is going to land going forward. And I think, so understanding how you take some of that underlying shifts that Karl's talked around, skills, digitization, the unbundling of work from employment, I think is a really powerful discussion. And then thinking about how does that then actually lay into the real world, in 2022? How does that change the way people think around the choice of being employed or the choice of being self-employed? Remember, the self-employed were often the worst people that suffered the most under the pandemic period. They were the ones that economically were most disadvantaged and less picked up by the support systems that the government's particularly put in place. So there are some really kind of, I think, some interesting sub-questions that really we need to also tease through here and understand what it looks like. And ultimately, from a corporate perspective, I think the challenge is we're really not sure where we land the other side of all of this. Mm-hmm. So to some degree, the common factor we've seen is, that business agility for companies has become like almost the number one thing, right? Because even if they want to be more profitable, they want to be higher performing, but if they can't be agile, that performance might be very temporary. So they have to understand how they are agile and ultimately more resilient as well. So I think all of these things all come together really to almost try and dictate to companies how they need to think about things. And from an employee perspective, the way I look at the world is different because of all of them as well.
Oh, I think that makes a lot of sense, and it's really interesting. There's some words in there stand out to me across what both of you have said. Agility and transformation and all of those kinds of things push us in one direction. But then when you hear a word like assumptions, which a lot of companies are making assumptions about what shape the world is going to be, a misstep in those assumptions, well, we know what we all call assumptions, right? It can leave us exposed and indeed exacerbate some of the things that Karl talked about with things like the Great Resignation and other things if we get these things wrong. Karl, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on any of the specific things David's kind of gone through there.
Yeah. David made a great point, and I think it's worth expanding on it, which is the need for this business agility and resilience. So in the CEO circle, business agility and resilience was like a buzzword pre-COVID. And now this has become the center of how a business or an organization can survive. It's just the headwinds, not just from the pandemic, but in general because of the digital disruption and this various economic mega shifts that we talked about, the platform economy, the creator economy that is sucking the talent out of the marketplace. All of that is requiring the businesses to become more agile and make that as a core strategy. Mm-hmm. The struggle that our community of the HR and broadly and L&D community faces, how do you align that core business strategy of the organization to become agile to translate or cascade that down to a agile workforce? And that is the key challenge for various global organizations that are facing is the CEOs are asking CHROs that, how are we building an agile workforce? Because the core of our business strategy is to be an agile business. Mm-hmm. And I think that drives at a very strategic level, the thinking about the human capital piece, which is, okay, if the work requires or the future of work, not even future, but the present work requires us to be so much agile of where the work gets performed, home or workplace or hybrid, whether how the work gets performed, who does the work, whether it's in a gig economy, a contractor or an employee or a developer through a platform economy. All of these are just has gone through this fundamental shifts just in the past few years. So there's a strategic need to reimagine, rethink, redesign the human capital strategy. Mm-hmm. And the good news is that because of this, human capital strategy is becoming the center point now in the CEO office. And it's not like something where, okay, the HR team will figure it out. It's become a business core discussion now, and it's central, and it's as important or more important than the CX, so the EX, which is employee experience, or I like to call TX, which is talent experience. I don't like to use the word employee because of those mega shifts that we talked about, which is creator economy and platform economy. Each individual is a businessman or a businesswoman of its own. So fundamentally, if you look at all the company organizations, there is generally a CX and a TX, and all the investments at the board level, at the CEO office level, at the line of business level, is invested in massive investment gets done in CX, trying to design an end-to-end customer experience because that's a revenue generator. And then the EX or TX got probably 1/10 or even less, depending on which industry you are, the investment, because it was always considered as kind of like the back office and it's a cost center and the HR team will figure it out. It did not get that level of attention in board meetings and from the shareholders. What the good news for our community here is that now that is shifting, and has already shifted in many organizations, where companies and organizations have realized that it's the TX that will ultimately drive the CX. And if you don't have a strong talent experience end to end, you cannot give a great customer experience. It's dead on arrival, right? It's a non-starter. So and that's why I say, may you live in interesting times, because I mean, it has both its positive and negative. It's a paradoxical statement, but the upshot is that this is the time where every organization is shifting and saying, I want to now make the TX a priority over CX. So the amount of investment that is going to go through over the next 5 to 10, 15 years in the human capital, getting it right, the whole end-to-end experience of how do you attract talent, how you develop talent, and how you retain talent. And these three KPIs are more important than your other KPIs, or at least similar or more important than your revenue or your EBITDA and your growth rates. And one of the things, right, that we're seeing, which SEC here, at least in the US, has started with some guidelines, maybe it's becoming mandatory soon, is that in the quarterly, at least for the public companies, when they are reporting their report card to the shareholders, and generally the CFO and the CEO talks about just the customer and the revenue and the EBITDA and the growth rate and all of that. There is no mention of human capital at all. And now there is a beginning of a new thinking and kind of like a new era where even SEC is asking public companies start reporting on your key KPIs on human capital. And once the public companies and the leading edge companies and the visionary companies starts reporting on a quarterly basis their human capital KPIs, particularly around their ability to attract, develop, and retain talent, everything will shift. So that's the good news.
Yeah, I mean, just picking up on that, I mean, we've got an expression sometimes from the research we're talking about. So, we talked about business agility becoming one of the critical measures really for companies, or critical goals. And simple statement is great people power great agility, right? So, or without that, it was, without great people, it's really hard to have great agility as well. So it's, somebody put in one of the comments in chat, it's actually about, it's about people, it's about culture, it's about other things. That's what really drives that, not just processes and systems, et cetera. And I think one of the things we also know is it's really difficult to hire great people. That's the other thing, the war for talent story, which has been going on in the background for a long time. But I think, again, one of the things we noticed from the pandemic was all the skills that really became super in demand, digital being a really good example of which, those are the ones you couldn't hire before, and now everybody wants them, right? So the challenge we've got is that the problems have been just becoming accentuated. And come back to the skills question, we need to really think about, obviously companies have got massive agendas around reskilling and upskilling their organization and realigning that to the needs of the business going forward, knowing that those needs change. But there's also at the other side of this, there has been a sort of a democratization of that process. And I think one of the things that differs a little bit between maybe in the US and in Europe is, certainly up until fairly recently, in Europe, when you start talking to organizations around talent and talent programs, this was a fairly rarefied thing. It was the senior leader pipelines, it was critical talent roles, it was the graduate intake and the hypo programs and so on. It wasn't everybody by a long stretch of the imagination. And I think one of the things the pandemic proved was that when we came down and started talking about critical talent, it turned out to be, the person on the front desk or the guy driving the bus or whatever it was, that they turned out to be the people that were really critical talent, not my chief people officer or whatever else. So I think that democratization of the talent process and thinking around how we get really disruptive around thinking about these things in a positive way, opening up a lot of that agenda to a mass audience in a way that works in a hybrid workplace. You know, a lot of the typical drivers we've had of the things that drove things like retention and development in the past have been very often anchored around very physical things. You know, even in tech firms, you know, they're almost notorious that in engineering functions, you know, the training and development means getting everybody in a room and talking about stuff, right? It's not, you know, that's not done in a virtual way generally, or something it had to be. And I think the transformation sometimes in the tech business has been as big as it has been for everybody else, right? And we haven't really talked about the other big elephant in the room, which is sort of kind of floating around everything, which is, of course, the sort of ESG agenda, you know, in particular thinking around the shifts that we're seeing around social climate change, the consequences around that whole kind of ethical agenda and so on, and the way that individuals react to that, as well as the ways that companies are needing to react to it as well. So I think come back to Karl's point about living in interesting times. I've been doing these kinds of things for 25, 30 years, talking about the fact that the pace of change is accelerating. And I think what we had was all of these things hit us all at once. And to some degree, how we then transition through from that, how we build strategies that are resilient and agile themselves. Because I think the challenge that we've had from an HR point of view in the past is that, you know, they for all that they've had or tried to have a seat at the table around this. You know, I remember going back 25 years ago talking about balanced scorecards, and you would go into a company and talk about their 3 quadrants short of a balanced scorecard, because the only thing they were worried about were the financials, right? Yeah. But even then they were talking about all of those other angles. And I think what we now in a situation is we just have to get that balance right? And we also have to understand how that story plays for the individual, for the team, as well as then for the company as well, and get the balance between those things right as well.
No, I think that absolutely. And look, there's some really very aligned questions coming in as you go. So if you don't mind, I'd like to just jump in with one or two of those, because they do talk to many of the things you've both just touched on.
Shay, if you don't mind, I just want to add on to what David said, and he brought up a very important point, something close to my heart, which is ESG. So I think ultimately every individual, when we, at their very core, wants to live a purpose-driven life, and work and workplace and employment or whatever it is, at the end of the day, has to fulfill the core purpose. And if organizations have to get super mindful, and not just mindful, but will have to bring this ESG on the top, because that's something that will align to pretty much everyone on the planet, because we all want to live, we all want to leave a better world than what we found. And environment, social governance, and becomes very key. And that's part of now this whole human capital disclosures. So that's a very important point for organizations from a retention purpose, because you can't retain people just on financials. And it's not just about shareholders asking you for your long-term sustainability and ESG, but even for your own employee retention strategy. If organizations have to align the purpose of the organization to make a greater, bigger societal impact, and that aligns with an individual. So a very, very important human capital strategy from a purpose standpoint.
As we said when we kicked off, my daughter being able to bring me a cup of tea while she's on a half-term holiday, right? That's a quality of life thing that I have now in a way that maybe I wouldn't have had pre-pandemic. So it's a very key thing. And some of the questions come in talk to many of these points. And if you don't mind, I'd like to put a couple of these to you both, and feel free to jump in. But the first one we had was, employee engagement can be difficult to maintain in this current sort of environment and post-pandemic, as employees are in very different personal situations, emotionally and professionally. How do we see that being measured? Or indeed, is it being measured? Because if it's not being measured, of course, it's really hard to kind of address.
Yep.
Sorry, so yeah, I mean, so I think we also we have to be really, really careful, because sometimes we look at certain things as a bit of a panacea. So employee engagement is kind of has reared its head as something that we really want to focus on. I mean, companies have been focusing for a long time with their annual surveys, etc. So we realize that actually that isn't really a very good measure of employee engagement anymore. And I think so we have to be very careful about the way we think about things, and what does it mean when we say they're engaged, right? The vast majority of people work to live, not live to work. Mm-hmm. And I think it's when we think about aligning to what is important for the individuals, we need to understand how we deal with that spectrum. And the chances are the person that's driving the bus is not somebody who is, living to work. It's the other way around. So I think we have to build strategies and that can understand how we engage with people, understand how we track what there is. Those are not all sat there in front of a desktop machine or a digital interface, right? That's not the way in which the majority of the world functions. And I think understanding how we can track, temperature check, get feedback. I mean, at the end of the day, the way we used to know most of that was because we engaged with them in a social context around work and within physically within the work environment. And you can typically, most human beings can sense when somebody is engaged or not engaged or whatever. The challenge is, how does that work in a largely virtual world? How does that work in a hybrid workplace where some of these people may hardly ever come into the office and may not intersect with when you're in there as well. So I think we have to really think about that in a different way. And we have to focus in it, not just on, putting people in front of systems. Somebody's employee experience doesn't come from an HR system, right? It doesn't come from having a really nice user interface on an HR system. It comes from the opportunities they have, whether they hate their boss, whether they feel they're being, sort of looked after, the opportunities they have to develop, all of those other things, the decisions that are made using some of those HR systems, yes, but not actually from the systems themselves directly. And I think there is a danger that the HR technology industry overclaims its responsibility for employee experience as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great thought. And I'll just add on to this very important question of employee engagement. It's a huge concern. As surveys after surveys, Gallup surveys year after year says 70% of the employees are not engaged at work. I look at 4 underlining reasons or things that you have to get it right for employment, for engagement. Number 1 is purpose. We talked about if the purpose of an individual has to align with the purpose of the organization. Otherwise, you will start seeing from a long-term standpoint, less engagement, because so that's number 1. Number 2, belonging. So organizations have just started realizing, and that belonging piece has gotten into a huge problem because of this remote work or hybrid work, because when you come to office, you're having coffee or lunch with your colleagues, the water cooler conversation, all that creates that camaraderie and a feeling of belonging. You meet with your boss, you feel humanized, that you can, joke, crack jokes with your boss. And that feels a little bit great belonging. But, as soon as you're remote, it's very hard to now recreate that belonging structure. And there's many other ways, but I think fundamentally people are feeling disconnected and that's, we've seen also Great Resignation, because they just don't feel that belonging. Mm-hmm. So that's the second. The third thing is growth, which is an individual will have an engagement in an organization if they see that there is a personal growth factor for them. The moment they see that, hey, I'm not growing here. Maybe the organization is growing, okay? The company is growing, their revenues, their financials, they're hitting their numbers in the market, but what about me? Okay, what's in it for me? So that needs to be the growth, the career ladder, the career plans, everything has to get personalized, individualized to the level that they understand. And it's a huge, difficult challenge, especially in large organizations. How do you do that whole career pathing? So that's the third piece. The fourth piece is on a day-to-day basis in terms of work is an interesting graph that I saw, like, X and Y axis was skills versus challenge. And it has a nice kind of like a parabolic curve, which says that if people are given work, the challenge in their work is lower than their skills, then they're bored, and so they're not engaged. If the challenge in their work is higher than their skills, again, they find it very difficult, they're struggling, and so again, they're not engaged. So getting that right balance, which is saying that, hey, the challenge at your role or your work that you're doing and the skills that you have is almost similar at a level, then you are producing and you're productive, and then you feel good and you feel happy. And so getting that balance right now, it's different strokes for different people. Some people do want the challenge in their work to be higher than their skills, because then that's the opportunity to grow your skills. But, in an organization, how do you find out which people want challenge same as their skills level, which people do want challenge higher than their skills level? And there are people who may want the challenge in their work lower than their skills level because they just want that comfort zone, right?
And so there are people, and there are people whose all their primary concerns, all their main factors are nothing to do with work, and what they just want to do is to go in and earn a decent amount of money, feel valued, have loyalty, feel loyalty from the company. They may not actually, for them, it may not always be about growth, right? It's just about feeling valued and appropriately rewarded, etc. as well. And I think that's the whole thing with a lot of this is, there's a theme actually under all of this we're talking about, which is almost the personalization agenda, right? Which means what I mean by that is, for me, what is important? What do I want to value? And that will change, of course, over time. I remember talking, before we were looking at millennials and then Gen Y and making sort of kind of characteristic decision, assumptions around what they would drive their behavior or not. And you say, well, it'll be interesting to see what happens when they've got mortgages and school fees, right? Will they fundamentally start behaving like Gen X's did or something like this? And of course, the reality of that is that it's true that behaviors certainly change over time. But we add in new things, the environmental concerns and so on and things like that. And the way, but that decoupling that Karl talked about slightly between this is there are a lot more people that can choose to be employed or not. And ultimately it comes down to, for them, risk and reward a little bit. And, if you can earn more money as a TikTok influencer than you did as a hairdresser or whatever it is, and, then obviously suddenly the risk of not being employed as a hairdresser doesn't sort of take on that whole thing. So that's where creator economy, I think, comes in a lot, because it's creating new forms of work and pay for people that really don't align to necessarily normal corporate structures. And that creates huge problems for the companies, because first of all, it means a lot of the people they wanted to employ or certain roles don't want to be employed doing those roles, right? Or they can be employed doing for themselves, earning probably more money. Why should they necessarily be employed, especially when they think they've got less risk being employed by themselves than by companies, because they can't control that basis of employment, So I think there are lots of dimensions to this which make it really, really interesting. But as I said, almost all of these things have hit us at once. The pandemic has kind of shoved us all through the mincer a little bit. And it's hard sometimes, for organizations to really understand how it's going to coalesce back together. We can make guesses. We can make some really good guesses sometimes, but we just don't really know.
Look, to summarize, like if you think from a CHRO or a CLO standpoint in any organization, they've got a massive challenge because it's such a difficult job. Think about, you have to get all the four things right. You have to get the alignment of the purpose for your individual. You have to create an culture and a feeling of belongingness. You have to have a growth plan and a career plan for every individual. And you have to get the skills level and the challenge level for that person right, balanced to that individual's outlook of what he or she wants. Imagine trying to do all these four things right for every single individual who are all unique people with their own individual goals and purpose. It's a hard job. And that's where all these investments in technology has to come into the level of personalization that we can do all these four things. And we have to rely on technology because with this remote work, you can't bring people together and, kind of try to create a sense of belongingness or whatever, it's just not possible. So how do you come up with great technology and tools that can enable this level of individual personalization and help the CHROs and CLOs to deliver on all these four fronts to drive that level of employee engagement that is needed?
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of fantastic questions coming in. With 20 minutes to go, I don't think we're going to get to them all. But to that very point, Karl, from Paul, he had said that, with some surveys showing 70% of employee disengagement, what behaviours should leaders model to re-establish that trust and buy-in from employees and address the kind of significant contributor to the Great Resignation that this is having?
David, you want to go ahead?
Well, I think they've got to create businesses and business cultures that people want to be a part of. Mm-hmm. That's probably the simple answer. Now, how you do that isn't simple, but I think, but at the end of the day, what we know is good leaders create and inspire good businesses around them, right? And the counter trend that you can have a great business and put in place a leader that can turn out to be quite destructive to the culture of that business and accentuate things. I think the Great Resignation type discussion is interesting because it goes like, well, why is this suddenly a big deal, right? And I think the reason because it's always, again, it's something that I think has been a growing challenge in the background. As there are alternative models of employment and earning money, we used to talk a lot about gig. That's kind of that sort of gone away a little bit, or has sort of morphed a little bit in terms of the conversation, but it's still ultimately there. But ultimately, it comes down to there are different ways in which you can choose to be employed and earn money, right? And or choose to work and earn money. And I think the more that is true, the more that ultimately you have to sit there and go, why do I want to be employed by you? And what is inspiring me to want to do that? So that's a factor. For a lot of people, they are still limited by geographical location, right? But again, that shift to digital and online and the shift to hybrid workplace has changed the boundaries around that hugely. And it's not just the fact, well, I'm now in, Idaho working for a Bay Area company, and they haven't yet kind of renegotiated my salary down. So I'm feeling like I'm really positive, but it's not just, I've got now the choice of working for another Bay Area company. I could work for a company anywhere in the world, right? Because suddenly that, if we've made those changes around the geographic, we've broken the links between being in the office and working for that business. And that has again been true in the background for a while, but only for certain kinds of roles. Suddenly we made it true for almost every role, other than if it's a physical located job, like in a store or in a manufacturing plant or something else. So we've changed those boundaries for things, and people giving people different choices. And ultimately they rediscovered that there were alternative answers. They didn't have to be on a daily commute for 2 hours each way. They could choose not to be and still think that they can kind of, and they can still earn a good wage because of that. So I think we need to understand what some of those trends are, and we need to create an attractive reasons why you would want to be employed by us at our company, right? That may be the way we treat you, but it certainly to some degree is how we pay you, but that's not as we know, that's not really the biggest driver for many people. The development, the growth thing that Karl referenced earlier is really important. Again, there's lots of analysis over time that talks around development as really being, for us, we talk about that as the anchor pillar of talent in many ways. It's one of the top attractors. It's one of the top reasons why people leave if they're not being developed, right? And ultimately, in a world where we've said skills is super critical, development is our biggest driver for those skills, especially if we can't hire those people. So I think, we're rediscovering certain things. I'm not sure many CEOs understand that yet, though. I think they use some of the language, And I think we see recognition around it, but we've always talked about, again, for a long time, people are our biggest asset, but the C-suite didn't behave like that.
Right.
And I think that ultimately will be the acid test, is does the C-suite start to behave like people really are the biggest assets? I said great people drive great agility. So how do we actually really bake these things in? And I think the challenge for HR as a function is stepping up and being able to really make a difference around those things, not just being a good owner of some policy and hire and fire procedure and stuff like this, but actually as an organization that really adds value into the business and drives business performance. And that ultimately has been a challenge. That's why, they're reporting into a line into a CFO or a COO or whatever it is, rather than really necessarily being right at the top of the tree. Karl, what's your view?
No, I think you covered very well. So I think you covered all the good points. I see more questions, and we have 10 more minutes. So maybe Shay, you want to?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, look, in line with all of this, there was quite an interesting comment that comes up, because I'm thinking through all the things you talk about, and when people are moving around, when people are looking where to go, when we're looking to grow, and when we look to grow ourselves. And on that point, it does amuse me, because I think people would be stunned at the number of edtech companies where they don't even use their own systems internally to help grow their people. But the question that came up, which I think was really interesting, is what do you guys think about the importance of skills credentials? And I think we're really talking about digital credentials here when we look at certificates and badges in providing, improving skill sets for individuals, and then aligning those with the job.
Yeah. Well, I'll give some initial thoughts, and David, happy to hear your thoughts. So, in the skills economy, it's things are getting unbundled, and there's an interesting reference to like even a skills marketplace, where we may get to a situation where, if in the next 5 to 10 years, or maybe 15 years, when everybody is kind of like a free agent, and you come together to get things done, and then you again, move back to some other projects, we will truly be in kind of like this skills marketplace. And think about like a stock market type thing, not exactly a perfect metaphor, but something like that. Because end of the day, there is a dollar value to skills. Otherwise, why would you invest in it? And when you are trying to get any project done, you need that very, very specific skills. So now the big challenge or question becomes, how do you digitally understand some person has that exact skills, and it needs all kinds of validation and credentialing, because it's just humanly impossible to go through 1,000 resumes and go through hundreds of interviews to get to the right person. The scale at which things are happening, the speed at which things are happening, we have to get to a digital first world where we are able to identify, find, and deploy, hire, retain, deploy talent based on their skills and capabilities. So definitely, any kind of credentialing that are validated credentials certainly helps. I have said before that, we are in this resume 3.0 world. So resume 1.0 was people will just type up their resume in Microsoft Word. They can write anything and everything that they want to write. And by the time we interview, we figure out that half of the skills that they mentioned in the resume is actually not there. And then the resume 2.0 is LinkedIn. But you still see like, vast majority of the LinkedIn profiles, people can write whatever skills they want to, and the reality is not there. So we have to evolve into resume 3.0 in this world of blockchain, in this world of, verifiers and validation and actual proof of work and things like that, which is the concept on which, by the way, blockchain or even Bitcoins work, which is, proof of work. And if we can put those demonstrated skills that you've actually been able to demonstrate, any kind of credentials that are validated and verifiable, that is a critical step for the industry to get. Not only it's good for the individual, because now they can find the right work and the type of work that they want to get into. Obviously, the rest of the things has to check box in terms of belongingness and culture and all of that, but just the work and the skills, like the 2x2 that we talked about, which is skills versus challenge. And it's important for organizations to be able to have that kind of a verified blockchain style, or I'm not proposing blockchain. It's a great technology, but anything that helps that kind of third-party validation. We've seen that in our own skills passport, where we have verified skills based on the actual projects or certifications, assessments, or work or learning that they've done, and the badges and the micro credentials that they've stacked up. And then there's also a peer assessment where other peers are able to verify and validate their skills. And that's a very important place to evolve very rapidly, given the speed and the scale of growth that we are seeing now.
I mean, in my terms, I put it really quite simply. The biggest evidence of skills is what you've done, not what you say you've done, right? And therefore it comes down to, can you prove that somehow? And in particularly, this is ultimately an ecosystem problem. Yep. When you think about it, when you're looking at people you're thinking of hiring, they're not people that are in your HR system, right? They're not people that you have that for. So how do you create how do you have that trail of evidence around that and that proof? And obviously there are organizations focusing on that using, like Velocity Network, using the blockchain technology as well, and in terms of connecting things across an ecosystem. And I think that's ultimately, all of this people's stuff is an ecosystem problem, both within a company and outside a company as well. And we have to work out how we do that. But, credentialing is part of that story, because ultimately the whole point about this is the provenance of the evidence. It doesn't matter if you want to use an analogy with wine or art, it doesn't matter. I can say this is a Picasso, that's not really worth anything. It has to be somebody who actually has provenance and evidence of expertise that needs to say that for that to actually count for something. And I think ultimately, when we're trying to deal with this in a mass problem, which is a hugely scaled problem, then we need those kind of points of proof. So I think we'll see more and more focus around it, not just in terms of credentialing on things like learning completions and stuff, but actually around thinking around, sort of the evidence that support, for example, skills. Skill is not you have it or you don't. Right? It's not a binary thing that we just use for tagging. That's one of the problems that we see within a lot of the solutions at the moment. You need to understand how skilled you are, right? Mm-hmm. And therefore that comes down to, and what is the evidence that supports that skill?
I think I'd like to make one clarification. So when we say skills, it's not just that we are looking for only skills in a narrow sense. It's also your potential. So I mean, there's a great saying, you hire for potential, not just for skills. Your ability to evolve and your potential, your ability to learn, your learnability is also a skill. So if I'm looking for, let's say, a particular skill, like let's say digital marketing, and if I find a great person who has all these other potential that's demonstrable, that he or she has picked up, learned, done, and delivered. And even if that person doesn't have digital marketing, that's fine, because you can take a bet on the person and say, hey, I know that this person has the potential, and I would have hired this person over somebody who doesn't have the rest of the potential, but just has all kinds of certificate in digital marketing, may not be the right person to hire. So just clarification on the broader definition of when we say skills economy. It's not just the skills that specific skills, but even a broader human ability to learn, develop, and be able to rise up to any challenge.
And apply that in a context that's relevant to your need, right? So when you're looking to hire a person doing it, you have a context, a business context in which you're functioning, and you need that person to be really effective. And I was in a conversation with somebody yesterday that said, you can have somebody who is the absolute world's best person at doing that. If they're rubbish at working in a team, I still probably don't want to hire them, right? So it's there's a context within which this has got to operate and deliver value for the company, and for the individuals themselves. And I think it's about all of those factors that come into play.
Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, we are living in the world where we keep seeing some of the surveys about what are the top 10 skills or hot skills in 2022 and what will be the top 10 skills in 2025. I'm personally not a big fan of that because first of all, it's hard to predict. It's nice to send out this kind of reports and it's interesting, but you never know whether they'll be true or not. What really matters is the growth mindset and the learnability of a person to be able to evolve to the new skills that will be needed, whether it is compassion or empathy, or whether it is programming skills, or whether it is whatever skill that will be required for you to perform the role or the job. That is what really matters. And so how do we train people? And this whole culture that we talked about for belongingness, but we have witnessed that in hundreds of Fortune 500 companies, that when they also create culture of learning, you are creating that mindset of learnability and the ability to evolve and create that agile workforce. So it may not be about some specific skills, but just creating that culture of learning is like the fabric or the foundation that you're setting up to create that collaborative environment, to create that environment where everybody wants to be able to rapidly evolve and be agile and pick on the next thing that is needed, not trying to predict what are the top 10 skills and then, hey, let's work backwards, trying to get specific skills. Now, it may be needed in some organizations that we've seen because they have very targeted projects. So we have customers we have seen in Fortune 500 companies where, hey, they have huge demand for cybersecurity from their clients. Let's say you're a professional services organization, 50,000 people, professionals, and you're seeing a lot of demand for cybersecurity. Sure, you need very specific cybersecurity level 1, level 2, level 3, and you need to have this 5,000 people trained within 6 months. And those are very, very specific skills. At that point of time, sure, you want to look at all these other stuff, their potential to evolve and your potential to be able to perform and learnability, but you also need a very targeted upskilling program to make that happen.
And that's the blend, isn't it? That's ultimately the way I talked about is the balance, in terms of what drives, what's the needs of the organization.
Yeah.
I need to have 1,000, cybersecurity people available to work on stuff because that's where our business is going versus, what the individuals are and how they all map together. And I think that's the exciting thing. That's ultimately, we can look at lots of these as intractable problems, but I think one of the things that I feel really positive about is that the kinds of, we've seen a lot of disruption around the traditional talent life cycle from these kind of disruptive specialist stories and things. And in fact, if you look at our 9 grid for talent and people success, one of the things that's really obvious is how dominated it is by specialists now, not by suites, right? And that's pushing back into the HCM world as well, right? So we've been in a situation where a lot of the HCM vendors have been trying to dominate the thinking of companies around how we manage this. But in reality, again, it's this, as I said, it's an ecosystem problem. It's becoming a lot more pulled apart. The other thing I was thinking about, one final comment as well, you were talking about, there was a word, for example, that Novartis uses a lot. They talk about curiosity, right? And being curious. And I think one of the things that you talked around there is around looking for, am I curious about what gets me forward, what makes me happier in my job, where I can add more value and be more rewarded, right? And I think there's something at the individual about how can we create that culture of curiosity in individuals. It doesn't matter whatever their role, whether it's manual worker or knowledge worker or CEO or whatever it is, whatever level they are, that still is equally of value, I think.
Yeah. No, well, unfortunately,
I was about to bring it up, so thank you. We are thinking alike.
No, that's great. And listen, thank you both. Unfortunately, we have come up against time. Fascinating discussion and a host of questions we didn't get time to get to. And I think the questions always show you that it's an engaging subject and people have enjoyed it. One small anecdote about the validation of the skills piece, David. We have a colleague who listed one of his skills on LinkedIn as time travel. And a whole raft of people validated him for his expertise in the area of time travel. So I think that talks very specifically to some of the points you've raised. But folks, I am very sorry to call time on the session, but I do need to. Just to round up and say, David, Karl, thank you both so much for all of your time. You're both very busy people, so we really appreciate that. And I'm sure the team have enjoyed it. I'm just trying to share a last slide. Is the slide on screen? Can somebody validate for me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So look, Fosway publish their new 9 Grid for Learning systems tomorrow, David, I understand. And I believe there's been some sort of shifts around for various of the different points you've talked about, this move from suites to specialists and other things. So I would urge everybody here, head over to the Fosway website and get yourself a copy of the 9 Grid report, and you'll find it terribly insightful. Here at EdCast, we have a fantastic paper for you on the creator economy, which talks to many of the points that Karl spoke to earlier on in the session, and you'll find that hugely useful. We will be sending out a link to the recording of this session, and I think what we'll also do, because there's some really thought-provoking questions came in we didn't get to, maybe we'll round those questions up and circulate those with the recording link as well. So with that, it just remains for me to thank you all for attending. I hope that you found it as useful as we did, and we look forward to inviting you to the next time we get everybody together. David, Karl, and everybody, thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.